I'd like to begin just picking up something from that fascinating reading about these impossibly heavy machines. I've seen it written that you wrote Neuromancer on a typewriter. Is that true?
I did, although historically it's scarcely as remarkable.
1984 it was published, is that right?
Yeah, no, it was written, I began it in '81 after writing and publishing 3 or 4 short stories on that same typewriter. And most of the undergraduate papers that I wrote while I was getting a BA in English. And I suppose it was slightly remarkable that it was a manual typewriter.
It's a pleasant thought that the cyberspace was invented on a kind of on a hunt and peck sort of manual typewriter.
Well, cyberspace was very, very thin on. Real cyberspace was extremely thin on the ground in those days, and the individual pages of the manuscript of Neuromancer look like topographic maps. There's so much whiteout and bits of paper glued on.
The reason I ask is because you've written about your current way of writing, and said that you're constantly drawn in lateral sort of directions by Google and Wikipedia. Not the kind of thing one could do on a manual typewriter, I suspect, as one writes. And it strikes me that, I mean, reading that and also reading the novel, I felt very strongly that one has to learn new ways of reading as well. I don't know if you've caught up with a website which is called Node.
Yes.
Which in fact gives you an extraordinary reading of your novel in which everything is concretized. Solidity of specification is added to your text. What do you make of that? And could you say something about your writing method at the moment?
Well, my writing method hasn't actually changed that much. It's just that it was very similar. It was very similar. It's similar at the start to what it is now. Very similar, except it was just fantastically slow because it was all being done manually by someone who is still not even a typist, really. I'm sort of a two-finger and thumbs or something. I don't even like to think about it. Somehow I get it done, but I had to do it all manually and very slowly. So the methods very much the same. One thing that's changed for me, and this is where Node comes in, is that now when I write, I have a sense of there being a sort of ghostly cloud of virtual hypertext hanging around the text of the manuscript. So when I've looked something up, when I've found something on the web and imported it into the manuscript, I now know that someday someone will Google it and likely find my source. And there was something like Node, at least one artifact like Node was created in the wake of pattern recognition, but I believe it took at least a year after publication to reach the equivalent density and size. So to have it happen prior to publication
is extraordinary.
It's stunning.
I don't know how many people in the audience know this, but know this website that William Gibson is talking about. But it was someone who got an early copy. I don't know if he was a reviewer or in fact it was a complimentary copy, and who to some extent worked through it and gave a kind of solidity of visual image to everything that, well, not to everything, but things which are crucial in the text. So, to take the first chapter with reference to the Mondrian Hotel, the Standard Hotel, and the Chateau Marmont, Sunset and Tower Records. There'd be kind of, as it were, images of those, which to some extent changes the reading in a very interesting way.
It does. It alters it, and I'm aware of it being... I'm now aware that it's probably being altered that way by unknown hands as I work. And that strikes me as one of one of those things that's genuinely new. I don't think this happened in quite the same way before. Often digitally empowered things that are presented to me as being, this is terribly new, and I say, no, it's not. That's not new. They did that in the 13th century. It just took a long time. And somehow there's something different.
Well, it's just like an illuminated manuscript, in fact, to be honest. But it does seem to me it makes reading makes reading your books very creative. This relates to another fact, and you used to write about the future. Now somehow the future has caught up with you. Mm-hmm. And in a sense, you're writing about the past almost, because 2006, some of the urban landscapes you talk about have changed, the Tower Records.
Yeah.
But I mean, one can do that. It's very much harder to do if, in fact, you're in the kind of distant future, it seems to me. It seems now that you're accessible to that kind of, as it were, hyper-annotation.
Yeah, that's true. When you're working in 2035, nobody can Google your stuff.
Yeah. Was that part of the motive of as it were, sort of translocating from future to present?
Well, I'm not actually sure why I eventually found it necessary to do that. One factor was that I had found myself protesting for the past 15 years or so in interview after interview that I wasn't really writing about the future, that I was doing something else. And I would always try to close that by insisting that I believed I could write something set in the present which would have the same affect as my earlier work. And at some point I think I just decided I had to call myself on that. I'd been saying it for too long without actually trying it. And then when I tried it, I found it with pattern recognition, I initially found it incredibly difficult, which caused me to re-examine what I'd been doing in the earlier, what it had been about the earlier works that had been so much easier. One thing was if I got into a bind with the plot, I could just invent some really cool piece of technology that would make it disappear. And that's one of the things that I've always been a bit uncomfortable with in science fiction, is the kind of machina ex deus, or whatever that is. It's not the usual God from the machine, but magic from imaginary machinery.
On this question of machinery, one of the things I find really kind of interesting, well, I find everything's interesting in work, but one of the things that actually sort of makes me think, which is always a good thing when one's reading novels, is in a recent review of Die Hard 4, of all things, in the LA Times, Kenny Turan said that the new supervillain is the computer, to some extent. This is now Dr. This is Dr. Evil. It's kind of Moriarty. It's the kind of it's a great name. But in your work, you're much more interested in the potentialities. I mean, potentiality is kind of key concept. In fact, you don't seem to have, iPods are not necessarily what the cell phone is to Stephen King in Cell. They're not going to kill us all. And it's very interesting. I mean, you seem to be to some extent experimenting with the potentiality of technology and how it's going, as it were.
Well, so much of what I've written has been based in emergent, in the turmoil of emergent technologies. Turmoil may seem a strong word for what something like mobile phones do, but they really do change profoundly. Like cellular telephony has profoundly and perhaps forever altered the experiential texture of London.
For instance, I mean, we live. There's a lot of kind of paranoia about surveillance society. Everyone's sort of, calls in sort of Orwell. But the GPS, the role of GPS in spook hunting is quite interesting in some ways. It seems to me it's almost like it's a new way of actually being human. You know, that everywhere you are is all, you're like a chessboard, like a piece on a chessboard.
Yeah, and we haven't. It's so far a relatively untapped aspect of whatever it is that what I used to call cyberspace is a sort of subset of. Years ago, about 12 years ago, I was going to do one of those teleconferences, and it was the event was in Milan, so I got up at this ungodly jet-laggy hour in Vancouver and drove downtown and went up in a tall building, and there was only a technician there, and he was setting me up to have this chat with an audience very much like this in Milan. And he said, you know, what you call cyberspace, he said, here in the in the phone business, we call it the cloud. He said, that's our cyberspace, the cloud. And I said, what's the cloud? And he said, the cloud is all the phones and all the systems and all the stuff. And he said, the really magical thing about the cloud is that you place a call here and it comes out here. And he said, nobody anywhere can ever tell you how it gets from A to B. And I said, yeah, that's my stuff. So it's not just cyberspace, it's the cloud. Yeah. And it's the GPS grid, and it's the way all of that stuff is growing, seems to be growing together and making more stuff, so that when I wrote Neuromancer, when I wrote Neuromancer, here it was here, and cyberspace was theoretically over there. But even if you were one of the lucky people who could get into a little bit of cyberspace in 1981, you didn't spend much time there. You came back here, where we've always been. But I think now our here is what I used to call cyberspace, and there is some relative state of non-connectivity. I think it has, as one of the characters in Spook Country says, everted. And we all live to one extent or another within its eversion.
It's kind of, it seems to be one of the functions of fiction. It's very hard to justify novels sometimes, but one of the functions is that they domesticate very difficult concepts in ways that people can then use them. I mean, you're familiar with this. If you've taken out a trademark on the words matrix and cyberspace, you'd be a billionaire by now. And yet there's, I don't want to keep talking about Neuromancer, but that book, it seemed to me, made it possible for people to understand, something which they otherwise would just be like a cargo cult sort of mystery to them. And it seems to me that legislation, which to some extent released the GPS thing, which you actually mentioned, is incredibly important.
Yeah,
it seems to me that's one of the things which is going to take off from your book. Would you agree?
I think, I hadn't realized until I did what passes for my research into GPS, I hadn't realized that there was an actual moment where President Clinton signed a paper and so that you could suddenly get your GPS coordinate, or almost your GPS coordinate, because the civilian version is a little loosey-goosey compared to the military version. But for an example of how how poor my research is, the book was about to go to press in the United States when my friend Cory Doctorow gently told me that your GPS unit won't work inside. You can't do GPS inside.
But that's quite an important element of the plot. You say you got that quite late in the day.
Well, it wouldn't work. I did, and in the advanced reading
Bobby
copies,
has to collateralize everything.
yeah, well, that was, I was very depressed to learn that it didn't work. And then I got a phone call from New York that there was a stage of manuscript correction, very late, not manuscript, but of galley correction that I'd forgotten about. So I spent a very long day going, top to bottom through the whole manuscript, working in Corey's fix, which was, once he told me that you can't do it, he said, but of course you could triangulate off the 3 nearest cell phone towers. So Bobby suddenly became slightly more convincingly necessary to the plot, but only in a desperate last-minute fix. And if my experience with pattern recognition holds true with this book, by the time the paperback comes out, my website will have accumulated enough typos and small technical errors that I'll need to slightly alter the paperback edition, which I did for pattern recognition. I never do that in any spirit. I wouldn't do that in any spirit of stylistic improvement. I don't really regard it as a literary move. It's something more to do with that cloud of hypertext that surrounds. I'm honoring the cloud of hypertext when I do that, I think.
That's another aspect of the new kind of digital literary environment, isn't it? I mean, just going through blogs, there are a large number of blog commentators on your work, but quite often they do pick up very minor errors. You sort of a name goes missing, Alejandro Alberto. You probably picked that one up yourself, and it's quite interesting. There's a kind of new sort of, as it were, attentiveness, a new kind of critical, as it were, alertness, which it seems to me is a very welcome but a quite remarkably new sort of phenomenon. Your work seems to attract that kind of sort of almost obsessive attention, which I mean is in fact good. Particularly if I'm lynched by the Gibsonites in the audience. But it is. I find that very heartening. It seems to me that people don't just sort of, as it were, switch off when they read novels anymore.
Yeah,
they switch on.
It's very encouraging. And I also posted fragments from the work in progress on my own blog and watched the responses, not for that's good or that's bad, or hoping particularly for bursts of enthusiasm, but simply that by posting them and looking at the reactions, I found myself in a different relationship to the material. And it gave me sometimes freedom to change it for no constant reason. Somehow it alleviated some of the fundamental solitude of the authorial task.
Talking of that, I mean, what's your feeling about fanfic? I mean, do you encourage it or not? I mean, if someone, I mean, some writers, J.K. Rowling is cool with fanfic so long as it doesn't get too pederastic. Anne Rice loathes it and sort of actually threatens to take any kind of any violator to the courts on grounds of infringement of copyright. Do you have a view on this?
Well, I think I'm agnostic when it comes to that. I've still, actually, come to think of it, I have seen some, although mostly based on Neuromancer, but I haven't seen that much. But it's almost my immediate reaction really is that it's none of my business. One, it's none of my business. Two, I probably wouldn't enjoy it that much. And possibly three, you really shouldn't watch people do this sort of thing.
Listen, no one wants to hear me talking. You want to ask William Gibson questions, so we'll now throw it open to the to questions from the floor.
Your previous novels, you've had a big sense of kind of melancholy about technology and artwork. There's always been a sense of loneliness in the characters. Spook Country tends to deal with slightly more political subject matter than you have done previously. But it seems to be dealt with there seems to be almost more of a tone of fun and friendship in the novel. Is there some sort of counterbalance going on there in the seriousness to the fun, or is that something you're aware of when you're writing?
No, I'm not conscious of, I don't really work there. I work a lot from the dream state, as much as possible from the dream state. I actually thought that, I had never thought that my earlier work was politically neutral. I mean, it always, over the course of the closing of the 20th century, as I was often praised for having predicted the internet, which is something I'm always happy to argue against, I was disappointed that I've never actually seen anyone suggest that I predicted the bad outcomes of globalization. But the world of Neuromancer is a very badly globalized world, and the subflooring of the North American society in Neuromancer was Reaganomics. I took Reagan's domestic economic policies and just rolled them out. Put them in the extrapolation machine, pumped them out, and got something that looked exactly like Mexico City. No middle class, a lot of super rich, lots and lots of really, really desperately poor people, lots of crime, lots of private security.
And no national parks.
Yeah, no national parks. So I thought, I never imagined that Neuromancer was a book that you could simultaneously enjoy and have a very high opinion of Ronald Reagan. But apparently you could, because some people were quite offended. Some people have apparently been quite offended by Spook Country in that regard. But I've always tried to be agnostic about emergent technologies. In fact, I think I am. I think I've actually succeeded. I think I actually am agnostic about emergent technologies. I'm neither a Luddite nor a technophile. I'm just in the middle, and I think that technology, for the most part, is morally neutral until you actually do something with it. It's what you do with it that will carry moral weight. It's not what it is. And something as commonplace and ubiquitous as the mobile phone today has, I believe, in my own experience, fundamentally changed the experiential nature of, let's say, the City of London. Because prior to the mobile phone, this was a city of frequently enforced solitudes. People went from one place to another, often alone, and it was never a culture where people chatted much to one another in the tube. And that world of Ezra Pound's poem about where he saw the faces of the people in the tube as petals on a wet black bough, that's gone. Because that was about being in the tube and not having a mobile phone. And not being able to phone your mom or your boss or your girlfriend.
But on the other hand, I mean, the iPod is terribly central in Spook Country, and the iPod creates a kind of an isolate. Quite often in the underground, I see 4 or 5 people just locked up in their own sort of iPod experience, which is completely impenetrable to anybody else. Is that not creating this lonely crowd that you say has been dissolved by the mobile phone and so on?
Yeah, that's true. That's true as well. Although each of these little critters has a nigh infinite number of different functions. But I remember I first saw cell phones in massively ubiquitous use in London. So I associate London with emergent cellular telephony. And I remember the time I came here and I'd spent an uneasy afternoon walking around Kensington thinking that some asylum had been closed because there were mad people on the street having spirited conversations with no one at all. And then I saw the little thing in the ear and I went, oh, what is that? Oh, it's those little portable telephones. And the previous cell phones I'd seen had been those big Motorola bricks, which Hollywood executives sometimes proudly carried in their briefcases.
Do you think, with the subjects that Spook Country deals with some of the heterodox countries in the world, do you think that cyberspace in your books may become a ground for cyber terrorism and for conflict between nations?
I think that to the exact extent that your question outlines, that it already is. It is where the digital. I kind of hesitate to call it cyberspace myself. The digital is increasingly where we do everything that we do as a society and as a species. It's where the bank keeps our money. It's where the stock market actually happens. And sooner or later, it's going to be, sooner or later I had assumed that it would be a place where entities of one sort attack one another in various ways. And since we don't, and the wonderful thing about the internet is that you would never have been able to get nation states to agree to the existence of something like the internet. But now that it exists, no nation state can afford to be without it. And I've always assumed that the internet in some way is actually antithetical to the very idea of nation states, and that's probably a very good and progressive thing. But I never thought that I never thought that it would be without tears.
Hi. Messianic heretics. Were you interested in before the book or during the book? Did they insinuate themselves into the book?
Well, I was interested in them before the book, but I hadn't quite realized they were Messianic heretics until I stumbled on Norman Cohn's In Pursuit of the Millennium, which is the book that Milgram is reading throughout. And then I sort of, I looked up at not at YouTube, but at Fox News, and said, "Hey, they're Messianic heretics." This stuff really fits. Actually, my most delicious moment with that was that after I had, Milgram had become a big Messianic heretic fan, I mentioned that I'd been, this had been happening in my text to the man who'd insisted for no particular reason that I read Cohn's book. And I said, you know, I've been doing this, and I said, the other cool thing that's happened for me is when I was writing Big N's Wikipedia entry the other day, I learned that his mother was sleeping with the Situationists. And my friend said, you know, Pursuit of the Millennium was Guy Debord's all-time, lifetime favorite book. And somehow that was like the kiss of something for me. I've just been very happy about that ever since.
It is Big End, is it?
Yes. Well, I'm one of those people who's without French, but I suspect that if one were French, one would pronounce it differently. I imagine that it's the sort of from the French end of the Belgian.
Bijon is not.
Yeah.
As you know, there's a great deal of kind of controversy about this in places. But I mean, if there are any PhD students in the audience, I'm sure, in fact, they'll have made a note that Neuromancer can be allegorized as anti-Reagan and Spook Country allegorized as anti-Bush. Would that be a misreading in your view?
Well, they could be. They certainly could be, and I'd be okay with either of those. I mean, there's certainly no way that I know of that Spook Country is cryptically pro-Bush, or that Neuromancer is cryptically pro-Reagan, except that either the world of Spook Country is, to me, actually the world of, in the sense of science fiction, the world of Spook Country is, to me, a lot scarier than the world of Neuromancer. The world of Neuromancer is pretty much, or whatever it's doing, it's going along on an even keel, and it's about 2035, and the climate seems okay.
Yeah, I know. Let's have more questions from the audience. Anyone got a microphone and speak up if you do, please?
I was just wondering, I know that Gibson was into the Mondo crew back in the early 90s, and I was wondering how much that sort of influenced your later work, or how much...
Not in any biblical sense.
Well, yeah, but I mean, I was just wondering if you think that something like that, because it seemed really exciting reading about it from this perspective. I was just wondering kind of where it went and whether it could come back again.
Oh, it seemed really exciting because my take on it from having met them was it seemed really exciting because they were writing about themselves and they were doing a lot of crazy drugs that nobody else had ever done, but it wasn't actually that exciting. I'm not, not for me personally. So, I mean, it could, I suppose something like that could come back. There's a sort of cycle in the world of that coming back. I mean, I'm of the, I think I've more or less come to the conclusion that drug experiences don't actually contain information. That rather they're experiences of tweaked information. I think I've come to the conclusion that the barmaid doesn't actually get any prettier. And that would be my ultimate argument with the Mondo 2000 people, because they all seem to be saying, she does get prettier. I saw it happen.
For people who read a lot of blogs like Boing Boing or We Make Money Not Art, some of the characters in Spook Country might seem quite familiar to them. Is that a deliberate tactic to engage for cloud of hypertext?
Not really. It's just that those are the... I find people like that sufficiently interesting that they work for me as characters. If the characters aren't sufficiently good company in some way, I'm going to have a bad winter. because I'll be, every day with someone who isn't very interesting. I'll probably have to drive them mad and destroy them in order to make it work, which never seems like the right thing to do. But yeah, I don't pick them for coolness, the characters. In fact, I don't even really pick them. They sort of force themselves on me, often like marked cards. They just keep coming back. I didn't think Big End would be in this book. It seemed kind of a cheesy thing to do, but he just kept popping up and handing me his business card, and I finally accepted, and everything started going really smoothly.
It's that wonderful concept of anti-buzz, which is another word that you should probably trademark, I think. Anyone got a microphone? Good. Please.
Hi. A bunch of us from the board are wondering, so if you and Neil Gaiman got into a fight, who would win? We're all wondering that, and we've actually had discussions, so if you could tell us.
I don't know. Neil's a very butch guy, and he usually wears at least one leather jacket, so I think he'd probably, just whip me.
Another question, please.
Hi, I noticed in this book you come back again to voodoo and the voodoo mythology, and I was wondering what drew you back to that archetype in particular, and if you think it has some particular resonance to the other things that you're discussing.
Well, I've always, or at least since I was very young, found that a very attractive theology. And it surprised me when it popped up. When it popped up in this, although I got Tito and I got Cuban Chinese, Russian-speaking Cuban Chinese, and I hadn't really thought about Santeria, but it's a naturalistic match, and so I let a little bit of it in, and it seemed to go very naturally. And also I like the idea that Tito prevails because Tito himself really is a faith-based initiative. It's just a different faith. Either those gods are real, and you can't tell from the evidence in the book, or they're absolutely subjectively real for Tito, who is evidently in a condition of absolute faith. And I sort of like the question of whether or not that's even a question.
Well, where does the systema come from? Is it?
Well, systema is a Russian term for well, obviously just for system, but it's what they call a supposedly Russian martial art, which I've never been certain of whether or not I believe it or not, but it's supposed, some of its practitioners claim that it came from Cossack dancing. And there have been, and in the post-Soviet collapse years, there's a kind of cheesy back of Soldier of Fortune magazine school of, we're selling, this is the KGB's secret martial art. And I wanted to, what I did with it in Spook Country is to imagine Tito's family importing it into their very, very dense family culture and starting to use it in another way, so that it's expanded into these sort of occult practices. Its use has expanded to cover their occult or religious practices as well.
becomes a kind of Harry Potter cloak of invisibility at one point in the novel, doesn't it? We can throw off
No,
terror.
it's but apparently, I didn't do too bad a job anthropologically. I've had a couple of self-proclaimed Santeros turn up on the American tour and say, oh, it's pretty close.
No dolls with sort of pins in.
Yeah, no, nothing, not that I know of.
Please.
There's fairly obvious similarities between Count Zero, pattern recognition, and the new book Spook Country, in that you've got a female hero on a big money and lots of hotels and so on. Are you searching for some kind of perfect investigative technological thriller form, or is it just coincidence?
Well, yeah, I'm searching for a really good hotel. Well, I wish I would, actually the question makes me think I should probably be searching a bit further afield. I don't go back and reread myself much, so repeating myself has become something of a fear. I have to trust my first readers for that. As for it, I have thought, like it really has been like over a decade since I've read Count Zero, but I remember that I was much more satisfied with having written Count Zero than I was with having written Neuromancer. Because when I finished Neuromancer, it looked to me like an unfinished dirigible, sort of from front to back. Like the start of the novel was really elaborated, and the middle was fairly well elaborated, and the end of it was just turning into gas for me. And nobody, by and large, people didn't seem to care. So I kept quiet, and not to diss the Golden Goose, but it was my first novel, and I wasn't entirely satisfied with it. And I think that's actually a good thing, that I wasn't entirely satisfied with my first novel, and I was slightly more satisfied with my second novel, because when I got to the end of it, I thought, well, I sort of know how to do that, The Count Zero felt to me like the first time I ever actually sat down and wrote a novel. Neuromancer, I sat down and produced a sort of novel-shaped thing that won a bunch of prizes.
In Spook Country, the character of Bobby never sleeps in the same square. Why is that? Is there a specific story behind that?
He's paranoid. He's a very, almost clinically paranoid young man, and since one of his jobs is to use some really, really advanced software systems to find out which square of the GPS grid something is at a given moment. I guess I thought that it was a likely form for his paranoia to take would be to assume that somebody else is trying to do the same to him, so that if he sleeps in the same square twice, something bad may happen.
Was Sarah Ferguson a deliberate choice of name?
Excuse me?
The Duchess of York, Sarah Ferguson, was that a deliberate choice of name?
Oh,
I mean, with reference to Bobby.
You're right. And I actually noticed I considered changing it. I considered changing it, but I arrived at it in some very backwards way. So it was, originally she was different first name, different surname, and then I went to Ferguson, and then somewhere along it she got changed to Sarah, but I never ran the full I never ran the full thing. It's a little bit like people who think that Case Pollard and Case, the protagonist of Neuromancer, must have there must be some symbolic link. But with Case, I thought that I knew that her mother had been a great fan of Edgar Cayce, the sleeping prophet of Virginia Beach, and that her father hadn't. And the mother having named the daughter Casey, the father insisted on feminizing it as Case. So I was very, very happy with that, and then got quite taken aback to realize that some people assumed that there was some, because they're homonyms, is it? That some people assumed there was some linkage there, even unconscious, but there wasn't. They're just case and case.
Question from the floor. Who's got the? Does anyone have a microphone?
If I may move away from technology for a moment, the two things that have always appealed to me most about your novels are coolness and the romance of the loner and the marginalised figure. Would you care to talk to those at all?
What? Coolness and the romance of the otherwise marginalised figure?
I think it's one of our PhD students.
Yeah, I don't know. Those are tenure track questions, definitely. I don't think I'm ever going to get tenure.
Cool is a big deal in the novel, isn't it?
Yeah, but cool is, I'm interested in what that is. The very idea, the fact that we have a word that we can use that way, and that it's been around now going on, I don't know, not 100 years, but it's been around, and we didn't quite have a word that worked that way before that I know of. So it's cool as a kind of late industrial, or now early post-industrial meme that spreads through our society and is powerfully marketable. People can't agree on what it is or what constitutes it or what has it, but it really moves units.
I've often wondered, when did you read Marshall McLuhan, who's Cool Medium is obviously, fellow Canadian, was he very big when you were actually?
I never actually read Marshall McLuhan. I got my Marshall McLuhan by osmosis. Mm-hmm. During the Summer of Love in Toronto, wherever you'd go, there'd be like big mediated McLuhan coming at you, and this enigmatic Canadian academic gentleman saying, well, the medium is the massage, and I was like, wow, what is it? But I never actually went, and that's actually been the way with me all my life. I have to admit it. I'll hear the catchphrase or the buzzword, and I go, wow, get really excited about it, but I won't read the text. And this was the case with Naomi Klein's no logo and pattern recognition, where the pattern recognition came out and everyone said, you must have read Naomi Klein's no logo. And I said, well, I read the title. There was a stack of books. It was a bestseller. I said there was a big stack of books in the bookstore, and I thought, wow, no logo. And more or less that was where Case's allergy came from Naomi's title. But I'm very lax with that, and sometimes I've had even better luck completely misinterpreting the meaning of a title or buzzword and getting something that was actually cooler than whatever it really meant.
Please, who's got the microphone? Yes.
Thank you for the reading. You mentioned Cory Doctorow earlier on, and I was just wondering, in X years, if you're still writing, how do you feel that your relationship with the audience will change as an author as text becomes more interactive and there's a potential death of paper?
I don't know. If I were watching, if I had a Google search set to alert me to the potential death of paper, it would probably be for the phrase electronic paper, because everything that people complain about in terms of all those terrible reading platforms that people have been offered as substitute for books, all of that stuff might vanish overnight if working electronic paper became sufficiently inexpensive to produce. With working electronic paper, you'd only ever need one book to last you all your life, because whenever you opened it, it would be whatever book you wanted it to be. But I don't know what the business model would be. It would sure save on trees, but I don't know what the business model would be. There's a passage in Spook Country where Big End lectures Hollis on how Hollis is an ex-pop star, enjoyed this brief window in which it was possible to be a pop star in that sense, and it was the window in which the manufacturers of recorded music were the only people who possessed the means of production. And as soon as tape and cassette tape and then CDs and DVDs and all of that came in, the music companies lost the monopoly on the means of production. We still today have something like that in place with print, and print is the oldest mass medium as far as I can tell, the first and oldest technological mass medium. And we go on a book tour through the United States, and everywhere you go, there are bookstores that are at least the size of this auditorium, crammed with books, most of them new books, and filled with people. And you go through 20 or 30 of those, and you see how ubiquitous they are, and then somebody says, well, what about the death of print? I don't know.
Are you good for another couple of questions?
Sure.
Let's have two or three more questions, and then...
Hi, you wrote about an art form, a digital art form that was spatially and electronically set at certain grid coordinates, which requires the use of specialized goggles. Can you please comment upon which art forms interest you now, these days?
Oh, I like them all. It isn't, I don't have, I mean, in a way I don't keep up. I mean, I wish I were the sort of guy who could say, oh, well, there's a man in Frankfurt who's making very large bugs out of virtual wax or something, but I actually don't know. I don't keep up with the arts that way, and I wouldn't necessarily go that far if someone said that I could go to a gallery and experience a working version of blended reality. Blended reality is what the VR people back in the 80s and 90s would have called the art that Alberto does. Alberto's art is geospatially specific blended reality. In blended reality, you see virtual objects in real space, or you interact with virtual figures in real space. And it's a bit dodgy to do, but you know, it was done a decade ago and could probably be better done today. It's the people who were doing it then wanted to do sort of paintballing environments where you could fight with virtual villains. So what was important to me with that art, with the art in Spook Country, was I was trying to make it graffiti-like and capital L lowbrow and non-tenure track. So somehow it needed to, for me, it needed to have the feeling of people who weren't quite in galleries yet, but who wanted to be. Like, I didn't imagine that Damien Hirst would be doing it, but people who secretly wanted to be Damien Hirst might be doing it.
Let's have two more questions, please.
Several of your books, you skim the subject of celebrity, going back to your statement earlier. What are your feelings on the rise of the micro-celebrity through the medium of Web 2.0 technology?
Well, it's the micro-celebrity. It's a very interesting idea. There's something weirdly democratizing about the internet. For instance, eBay has democratized the function of curatorship. eBay has democratized a kind of expertise that could previously only be obtained in the flea markets of Europe's largest cities. But now a smart little kid in a suburb of Cleveland could sit there and figure out all there is to know about some particular kind of china and know the market like the back of his hand. That didn't used to be possible. And in the same way, the internet has democratized celebrity and producing what you call micro-celebrity, but I'm not really sure how micro that is. On my American tour, I met Craig Newmark, the man who founded Craigslist, which I thought was extraordinary to meet him, because that's an extraordinary thing to have done. I met one of the two bloggers who produces the Poor Man Institute, which is one of my favorite parodic political blogs. And I met a man who claimed to be the creator of the Node website that you cited earlier, who told me that he lived in a very, very small town in Colorado, and the work had been done by a globally distributed mass of volunteers.
Really?
Who had seen what he was doing and turned up and offered to help. So those people, to me, were the celebrities of the tour. And the size is relative, like micro, macro. So it just sort of depends on where you're sitting.
Can we have a last question, please? Anyone have a microphone? Oh, please.
You did a reading in Second Life a couple of weeks ago. How was your experience? Do you think you'd be going back? Is it what you expected from cyberspace 20 years later?
It was better than what I had been led to expect by my own solo and anonymous previous forays into Second Life, which reminded me sharply of everything I hadn't liked about high school. And often left me feeling as though I were walking by myself in large circles around a shut-down shopping mall at 4 a.m. outside Edmonton, Alberta. But when I found myself like taken into the hot throng of Second Life to do my reading, I had more of a sense of what people like about it. It's just that I never imagined it I never imagined it, and I'm very naive this way, but I never imagined it being corporate in quite the same way. And I wouldn't have imagined it that way because it was too much of a Disneyland. It'd be too much of a Disneyland field. When I did my take on something like Second Life and Idoru, the little fangirls have built their world in the cracks of these huge corporate ghost sites that no one visits at all. And I like that much more than the idea that it's happening in these sort of user-built modules in Disneyland, but the economy is controlled by Disney, quote, you know. It's not really Disney, but there's a Disney-like thing going on. And also, no one liked I arrived at my original avatar when I went in by myself by deliberately setting all the sliders in what was clearly the opposite direction that one would set them in to be good looking. So I wound up being like a blue Smurf. I was a blue Smurf with a white tutu. And I quite liked that, and I thought it was styling, and I went out and walked around, and people were just very rude to me. And then I saw people on the street for weeks who looked like they had escaped from Second Life, and that really scared me.
I'd just like to say, on behalf of Blackwell and of Sci-Fi-London, a huge thank you to William and to John for a wonderful evening. If I could hear one more round of applause for them both.